Last week, like him, I was in Brussels meeting with heads of government and leaders of European socialist parties, one of whom said to me, No, what they said, Mr. Speaker,
Who indeed? Who indeed? Well, among other things, Jeremy Corbyn is a Member of Parliament for the London constituency of Islington North, the current leader of the Labour movement and Her Majesty's opposition, and an individual who has spent most of his political career promoting any person, party or policy that would undermine or outright assault Britain and the British people. Last week, the most recent story in this vast chronicle came to light as allegations from Sarkozy... No, not that one. Agent Jan Sarkozy named Mr. Corbyn as a paid-up informant for the Czechoslovakian Secret Service. Known by the pseudonym Agent Cobb, Jezza apparently met with Mr. Sarkozy on several occasions during the 1980s to warn the Kremlin about British operations against Soviet personnel.
Oh, there's a big surprise! That's an incredible... I think I'm gonna have a heart attack and die from that surprise! What are we gonna do? We got a big problem here, a big...
In the last few days, the Sun, the Mail, the Telegraph, the Express have all gone a little bit James Bond. They've found a former Czechoslovakian spy whose claims are increasingly wild and entirely false. He seems to believe I kept him informed about what Margaret Thatcher had for breakfast and says he was responsible for either Live Aid or the Mandela concert, or maybe both. It's easy to laugh, but something more serious is happening. Publishing these ridiculous smears that have been refuted by Czech officials shows just how worried the media bosses are by the prospect of a Labour government. They're right to be. Labour will stand up to the powerful and corrupt.
Yeah, save it for the ladies, Jezza. So, ridiculous smears, apparently. A bad James Bond novel, even. What do we think? Red Finger? I quite like that one. The Spy Who Bored Me. These are off the cuff, you understand. I'm sure you can all do much better. Now, of course, I have no idea if these allegations are true, and I must say, there are aspects to the story that don't really gel, if we're honest. A claim, for example, is that Corbyn was paid for classified information. Firstly, what classified information could he possibly have had access to? Before 2015, the man was a relatively unknown and insignificant backbencher confined to the fringes of British politics. But more importantly, look, you don't need to pay ideologues who already agree with you. Bribery is typically reserved for people whose conscience actually points them in the opposite direction, and so they need to have their wheels greased a little. Jeremy Corbyn, on the other hand, is proudly sympathetic to Soviet ideals and always has been. But this does lead me on to one undeniable fact that I think can be concluded from the whole thing, which is that although it might be fundamentally untrue, and as I say, who knows, it's certainly plausible, and that's enough to terrify me, okay? Accusations of this kind, were they levied against Tony Blair or Theresa May, they'd simply be laughable. But when laid at the door of Mr. Corbyn, they actually slot in rather nicely as yet another stitch in the man's career-long tapestry of treachery and trash judgment.
On Northern Ireland, you didn't just deal with Sinn Féin. You dealt with the IRA 3 weeks after the Brighton bomb, in which the IRA had tried to destroy the democratically elected government of this country. You invited 2 convicted IRA terrorists to the House of Commons.
They were former prisoners who had come out of prison, women who had come out of prison, came to Parliament, actually in a meeting that had been arranged long before, to talk about prison conditions and rehabilitation of prisoners.
They were IRA.
Is there anything wrong with that, since they had a spent conviction?
They had their organisation had just tried to blow up the British government.
The whole history.
Did you not think about that?
Of course I thought about it, and
you still invited them in.
And I wanted a peace process. That's why I maintained a level of contact with Sinn Féin throughout that period, as indeed secretly the British government.
You didn't want a peace process. You wanted a united Ireland. You saw Northern Ireland as an imperialist colonial situation.
I do believe ultimately Ireland should be reunited, but I also never believed, and I don't think anybody else did, there was ever going to be a military victory for either side in Northern Ireland. Right. There had to be a peace process, and there was a peace process, and I am not ashamed of those of us that had the courage to step outside and say there has to be discussions that involve people from the Republicans.
Just tried to blow up the government.
With discussions with people in order to bring about a ceasefire, which did indeed happen, and the second ceasefire finally brought about the Belfast Agreement. Surely that is a good thing, and that's actually a great achievement for Mo Mowlam and that Labour government.
Yes, but notably not for you, Jeremy. And this is what amazes me about the whole thing. Mr. Corbyn was undeniably associated with the IRA throughout the Troubles, a supporter of their demand for a united Ireland, and a sympathiser with the violence they deployed in an effort to achieve that goal. And this pathetic attempt by him and his naive sycophants to spin his involvement as part of some sort of anti-war peace campaign, it's just embarrassing beyond belief. Firstly, he never took part in any official peace process. He wasn't a member of Blair's cabinet or Mo Mowlam's negotiation team. And secondly, all you have to do is read what the man endorsed at the time and who he danced at the disco with, so to speak. For example, at the height of the conflict, Corbyn sat on the editorial board of the London Labour Briefing, a Marxist-leaning magazine. Now, just take a look at some of the viewpoints expressed in this periodical at the time and decide for yourself if peace is really what's being promoted here. Let our Iron Lady know this: those who live by the sword shall die by it. If she wants violence, then violence she will certainly get. Not entirely peaceful, then. What do you call 4 dead Tories? A start. They borrowed that one from Gandhi, if I'm not mistaken. And after the Brighton bombing, in which 5 people were killed, one of them a Conservative MP, the British only sit up and take notice when they're bombed into it, which was the B-side to Yellow Submarine, I think, so all's good there. From 1986 to 1992, Mr. Corbyn spoke every year at commemorations in London to show support for IRA quote-unquote prisoners of war and remember the IRA dead. He would pop up frequently at protest meetings honouring so-called martyrs, often alongside his friend and appointed second-in-command of the Labour Party, John McDonnell, a man who himself said in 2003, "It's about time we started honouring those people involved in the armed struggle. The peace we now have is due to the action of the IRA. These people were not bipartisan peace negotiators, you understand. They were agitators for the other side."
Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell were seen as wholehearted supporters of the provisional IRA right throughout the Troubles in Northern Ireland. Obviously some of them, you know, at different periods more involved than the other one. But they were continuously seen as supporters, so as people who support, in their view, the armed struggle in Ireland. Certainly IRA volunteers, IRA people would have been desperately shocked and surprised if they were told they didn't support us, you know. There's absolutely no doubt that Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell's and others' involvement prolonged the IRA struggle and gave encouragement to it. They were never interested in peace. They never worked for peace. No one ever involved in any part of the peace process for 20 years in Northern Ireland ever remembers them. You know, they were useful idiots and fellow travellers and unfortunately also agents of influence, in the sense that genuinely, how would you expect an 18-year-old IRA person in Belfast to not believe that Jeremy Corbyn and people like that were important? He doesn't know. It's not now, it's then. And what he sees is them supporting you.
Turning to the Middle East and the problem with Islam, Mr. Corbyn has been providing succour for enemies of the British state and her allies for years.
Tomorrow evening it will be my pleasure and my honour to host an event in Parliament where our friends from Hezbollah will be speaking. I'd also invited friends from Hamas to come and speak as well. Unfortunately, the Israelis would not allow them to travel here, so it's going to be only friends from Hezbollah. So far as I'm concerned, that is absolutely the right function of using parliamentary facilities. And the idea that an organisation that is dedicated towards the good of the Palestinian people and bringing about long-term peace and social justice and political justice in the whole region should be labelled as a terrorist organisation by the British government is really a big, big historical mistake. And I would invite the government to reconsider its position on this matter and start talking directly to Hamas and Hezbollah.
Again, much of the defence of the now infamous "our friends" reference has centred around a rather sly and unconvincing appeal to inclusive language designed to open the door to dialogue. This, of course, contains the absurd assumption that you can actually talk to Nazis and arrange peace with people who have anti-Semitism built into their foundations and preach filth like this on a daily basis.
أيها الأمريكان سيعاقبكم الله أن يعلن الله الحرب عليكم يا آكلي الربا. اطلقوا العلم الأمريكي بفضل الله سبحانه وتعالى. هيئوا كل التحية إلى المقاومة الأفغانية في أفغانستان التي تمرغ أنف جيش أمريكا.
أنكم وكأن الذي قتل يهودي واحد كأنه قتل 30 مليون يهودي.
مسلمين لثأرا لا والله لن ينقضي
على يهود هنا في فلسطين. هذا من أروع ألوان البركة الحقيقية لفلسطين.
الله أكبر من أمريكا وأكبر من القوى العظمى، ونقول لهذا الغرب ستهزمون والله. والأمة العربية والإسلامية اليوم صاعدة ناهضة سوف تستعيد زعامة العالم. الموت لإسرائيل، الموت لأمريكا، الموت لأمريكا.
And once again, like Northern Ireland, where are our friends from Israel, Jeremy? Were they invited to tea at the Commons as part of this little entourage, or is the peace process you're apparently leading here as well supposed to be unilateral? Jeremy Corbyn turns down meetings with people like Netanyahu, as it happens, one only a few months ago. And to describe Hamas or Hezbollah as social justice movements dedicated to the good of the Palestinian people, it's demented. I mean, it's simply insane. Hamas slaughters fellow Muslims in the Gaza. As soon as they were apparently elected, they shot their own opposition in the back. And someone please explain to me how building bunkers, filling them with missiles and then putting hospitals on top is the action of a group that cares about the Palestinians, that has their best interests at heart. The concept is, and I use the word seriously, offensive. They clearly have no respect for human life, whether it be Israeli or Palestinian. These groups chant death to Israel, death to America, and are rightly recognised as anti-Semitic terrorist organisations by the British government. Now, just to be clear, I don't regard Jeremy Corbyn as an anti-Semite. I regard him as a moral idiot, as someone who is psychotically confused, and someone who rather enjoys taking a bash at Britain and her allies at the earliest convenience. He even holds us responsible for ISIS beheadings, for Christ's sake, and quasi-justifies the religious murder of British citizens at the hands of these sadists.
A period of silence for Alan Henning and all those others that have died in this appalling conflict. Because we have to remember them and remember that the price of war, the price of intervention, the price of jingoism is somebody else's son and somebody else's daughter either being killed or being killed by somebody else.
And we have to recognise that the security of this country is at risk. It's at risk because of the way we inflict an insecurity on so many other people around the world. We have to be very clear about that.
His ears are positively primed to detect and combat so-called Islamophobia, a term literally invented by Islamofascists to neuter the West and make criticism of the one ideology seeking to destroy us difficult. But he's happy to promote theocratic pond life like Ibrahim Hewitt, for example.
I've yet to come across
Would
any...
you like to live in a Sharia state?
It depends where it is. I've been...
You wouldn't like this country to become a Sharia state?
I don't think it would.
Would you like it to be?
Obviously, I would like to live under Sharia.
And in that, you would condone stoning of adulterers, for example?
No, not necessarily. It's a far bigger issue, Jeremy, than this. You cannot just pick and choose bits and bobs of the Sharia. It's a very broad issue. The social strata, the circumstances have to be
So what if the Sharia conditions? What if the Sharia conditions for stoning were
This
met?
has nothing to do with the education. Let's look at the education.
No, but that's what's being taught in the schools.
About.
So if the Sharia conditions for stoning the adulterer were met,
being taught in schools.
Then is that something in principle we should condone?
It's not being taught in school.
You do condemn the amputation of hands and the stoning to death.
If it's not according to a due process of law in any situation,
So if it's by due process, it's okay to stone people to death?
But the fact is that these things are not taught in schools.
No, Ibrahim, sorry, if by due process, is it okay to stone people to death by due process?
This thing is not taught in schools,
right.
And that's what we're here to discuss.
Personally, a very big thank you to Interpol for its work over a very long period of time. I've got to know Ibrahim Hewitt, the chair, extremely well, and I consider him to be a very good friend.
And organisations like the Islamic Human Rights Commission, who annually host repulsive ceremonies such as this one.
And the winner for the International Islamophobe of the Year is, you guessed it, Charlie Hebdo.
Charlie Hebdo, the winner, ladies and gentlemen. No, we missed one.
We missed one.
We missed one. Shall we do him?
This is a bomb.
Ooh.
This is a fuse.
Ooh. And hopefully it will blow up in your hand. Right. So, no one from Charlie Hebdo could make it.
The Islamic Human Rights Commission represents all that's best in Islam concerning the rights of individuals to free expression, to peaceful assembly, and the rights of individuals within a society. And I like the way it works. I like the sense of values surrounding it.
His judgment stinks. And that's me being generous. If I were more aggressive on this, I would say he has a real problem with Britain and most of what she stands for. And my enemy's enemy is my friend. And if I'm wrong on this, explain to me why he supposedly supports the right of the Palestinians to self-determination, but opposed the British liberation of the Falkland Islands and still can't bring himself to celebrate it even today. Remember, the people of the Falklands identify as British, voted overwhelmingly to remain British, and were the victims, nonetheless, of military aggression by the jackbooted fascist junta of Argentina, which our intervention subsequently destroyed, by the way, which we never get any credit for. While we're on the topic, we ended fascism in Argentina for free. You're welcome, world. You're going home with that. That's on its way to the hospice. Don't mention it. I mean, there is only one side any reasonable person can take in that conflict, and yet Jeremy Corbyn falls short. He was perhaps too busy advocating for the dismantling of the UK's nuclear deterrent, which was a past policy of his, not bilateral talks, with the purpose of reducing the stockpile globally. Oh, no. Unilateral disarmament. Basically leaving us and our European allies at the mercy of Russia, China, or any rogue state that would mark us for destruction. The only thing each of these positions have in common is their direct opposition to the interests of the very country this man is seeking to lead.
You know, I would actually swap Bernie Sanders for Jeremy Corbyn.
Really?
I am running out of words to describe how extreme this lurch by the Labour Party is. I mean, the best I can do is to quote a couple of his own positions. So he's cool with Iran having a nuclear bomb, but he doesn't want Britain to have one, right? He's determined to have self-determination for Palestinians, but he doesn't want it for people in Northern Ireland or in the Falkland Islands. He wants to mine coal, but he doesn't want to burn coal. I mean, this guy, I suppose, even more than Sanders, he is trying to revive an ideology that we all thought had been buried under the rubble when they pushed over the Berlin Wall.
Look, as I said before, I have no idea if he colluded with the Soviets. More evidence may come to light, and if at any point it is shown beyond a reasonable doubt, then the Queen should issue a one-way ticket to the Tower of London. Sharpish. He'd make a very handsome throw rug. I suspect not, though. What's far more likely, as O'Callaghan was indicating earlier, is that he's just a muddled ideologue and useful idiot. He chums up to and promotes all manner of galactic filth and debris out there as a result of some misguided sense of self-righteousness, and he'll continue to befriend villains and make excuses for atrocity in this utterly foolish manner until, like useful idiots everywhere, he becomes irrelevant. Okay, so that might be a little bit over the top, but the point is, he's not some mustache-twirling psychopath, he's not Blofeld. He's deluded. But that's more than enough to make him dangerous.
But let's talk to somebody who knows a lot more about this. Professor Anthony Glees, intelligence expert at the University of Buckingham, also a member of the Oxford Intelligence Group. Professor Glees, a very good morning to you.
Good morning.
Good morning. Good morning.
Thank you very much indeed for joining us. I'm not quite sure on the sort of status of these papers, the files that have been discovered. Were you party to discovering these files, or have they just come to your attention?
Well, they were brought to the attention by the Sun newspaper, who've been doing research on Jeremy Corbyn's files, as it were, both in the Czech secret intelligence archive, which is where these files come from, but also in the archive of the East German secret intelligence service, the Stasi, where there are also files. But in the case of the Stasi files, Mr. Corbyn has to give his agreement to the Sun examining them, and he's refused to do so. It's a different jurisdiction in the case of the Czech state, and these files are absolutely genuine. Of course, you know, people would say all sorts of things if they were in Mr. Corbyn's position, and one thing that they would say is they're forgeries, they're fakes. Well, they're not fakes, they're not forgeries.
Right. And to be fair, he's not saying that. His people are just saying, look, he spoke to a guy he believed to be a diplomat. Now, does that make him naive?
Well, it certainly makes him naive. I mean, I think that's the very least that we have to accept, because it wasn't just one meeting at a cocktail party. It was a course of conduct on the part of Jeremy Corbyn. He had several meetings, and the files, the extant files, do not state that the relationship between the Czech intelligence service and Jeremy Corbyn ever came. That would be recorded in the files. These were secret intelligence files. They would have gone to the KGB in Moscow, and for somebody to be rejected, that would be extremely important. So he didn't reject them. He held several meetings, one in his constituency office, and they, the Czechs, believed he was their agent with a code name and a unique registration number. That's the important thing. Now, does it follow he was a spy? Not necessarily. He could have been extremely naive, but I agree with what Katie just said. You know, one way or another, this shows that this is somebody who many British people, I think, would find it hard to see could safeguard our country's security properly.